Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special webinar. My name is Tim Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's live talk, Plastic Humans, the Story of Microplastics in Our Bodies. If you don't know us, and I hope that you do, Environmental Defence is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with the government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling here from Toronto on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. These communities are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land, and that we were invited into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we are all calling in from different locations around the country, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land that we're on today. As we start this webinar, let's keep in mind that it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Now, today we have with us three fantastic speakers, and I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation today. So the three of them are Dr. Rick Smith, who's the Executive Director of the Broadbent Institute and co-author of the best-selling book, Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Also, we have with us a really important researcher who's going to help us dive into the science behind of what's going on with microplastics today, and that's Dr. Chelsea Rockman, and she's an assistant professor in ecology at the University of Toronto. And last but not least is Ashley Wallis, who's our plastics program manager at Environmental Defence, and she's going to dig into the solutions to the crisis that face us. If all of you could just say hello.
Hello there.
Hello, everyone.
Good to be here.
Thanks again so much for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to explain a bit about how you can interact with us live on this webinar. If you're joining us live on YouTube or Facebook, there is a chat box at the bottom or the right of your screen. Feel free to say hello or discuss with each other and send us your questions there. We usually get a large volume of questions, so we won't be able to answer them all, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. So just a little bit of background to warm us up before we get into the conversation today. We're going to be discussing a topic that is deservedly getting a lot of media attention lately. This is microplastics and how they're affecting the environment and human health. Normally, what springs to mind when people think of the global plastic pollution crisis are images of shorelines full of plastic waste, or perhaps images of animals entangled in plastic bags or six-pack rings. However, while these plastics have well-known and devastating impacts, they could also be part of the source of plastics that could be having additional impact on our environment and health, and are almost impossible to see by our naked eye. These are microplastics. These are tiny, tiny particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters in size, so you really have a hard time seeing them, and some of them you can only see with a microscope. A few years ago, the problem of microplastics really caught the attention of the media and the general public when it was brought to light that microbeads, these tiny plastic beads, were being added intentionally to our personal care products like body wash, toothpaste, etc. And then they were ending up in the environment. This caused a great deal of concern in the science world, environmental groups, environmental defense, and the public at large. In fact, so much so that after a concerted effort, the federal government finally banned microbeads being added to these products in 2016. However, this victory was only made a tiny dent in reducing microplastics in our environment. In fact, recently, research has found that 98% of samples contained microplastics, indicating that microplastics in the air we breathe and also fall from the sky in our rain. In fact, microplastics have been discovered in every corner of the earth, from the highest mountains to the deepest sea trenches. It's even in the dust that blows around the planet. So what does all of this mean for the environment and our health? And what are the solutions to these problems? We're going to take a closer look at all of this today. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rick Smith. Rick is the current executive director of the Broadbent Institute and a past executive director of Environmental Defense. And he's co-author of the best-selling book, Slow Death by Rubber Duck. Rick's recent self-experimentation and some of it's kind of gory about plastic pollution was featured in the Globe and Mail, where he wrote a great piece about that, and has resulted in him being one of the first people in the world and the first in North America to find microplastic particles in his body. So today he's going to tell us a lot more about this experiment, how he did it, and what some of the key findings are. Take it away, Rick. Rick, you're on mute. Sorry.
Tim, you let me go on for minutes on end without my knowing. But I will. Let me begin here. Hello, everyone. All right, let me start here. And sorry about that minor technical glitch. I just want to start by saying it's a real pleasure to be sharing this virtual stage today with Chelsea Rockman and with my friends and colleagues at Environmental Defence, Canada's greatest environmental organization, talking about something that the United Nations has called the second greatest crisis facing humanity after climate change, and that is, of course, this problem of plastic pollution. We all know that this plastic problem is enormous. In fact, the numbers are so big, it's hard to wrap your head around it. An incredible half of all the plastics ever produced have been made just in the last 13 years. If the plastics industry gets its way over the next couple of decades, plastic production is going to double. So what we have on our hands is an enormous challenge, and frankly, it's a highly visible problem. As Canadians, there's nothing more familiar than Tim Hortons coffee lids blowing down the street. Plastic pollution is everywhere. It's all around us. But the question that I want to ask today is, what if the biggest problem with plastic isn't what we can see, but what we can't? And what you see in your screen on this person's fingertip on the right-hand side of your screen, what you see here are microplastics. This is what Tim Hortons coffee lids and every other type of plastic in the environment break down to with sunlight, with the passage of time. Plastic in the environment never really breaks down. It just keeps getting mushed up into smaller and smaller particles that reach a micro scale. Particles that are so light, so buoyant that they circulate in the ecosystem, as Tim has just mentioned. Perhaps the biggest, I think, and most important question that we need to ask right now in terms of microplastics is this. Are microplastics getting into human bodies? And if so, what are the health implications of that? Now, I've been worried about plastics and this whole question of toxic chemicals for about 10 years now. In 2009, Bruce Laurie and I co-authored this book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck, that tried to zero in on this problem of toxic chemicals being absorbed into the human body by the consumer products that we use every day. Some of the chemicals we looked at, like phthalates and BPA, are very common in plastics, and they've been linked to serious human diseases like breast cancer and prostate cancer. I started wondering about 10 years ago whether the toxic chemicals in our bodies might be derived not just from the contents of the consumer products we use, but also perhaps the packaging of the consumer products themselves. What happens if micro pieces of the consumer products we use every day are breaking off and being absorbed into our bodies? Fast forward 10 years, and last year there was a tiny little study, scientific study released in Europe for the first time finding microplastics in human bodies. And I decided that I wanted to be the first person in North America to look at this issue. So I worked with an expert lab at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And together we designed a very simple 6-day experiment that I conducted on myself earlier this year. For the first couple of days of the experiment, I just lived my life normally. For the last few days of the experiment, I tried to crank up my everyday exposure to plastic. So as you can see here on your screen, I only ate food that came shrink wrapped in plastic, things like ramen noodles. I only used bottled water in my cooking, only consumed bottled water in my coffee and tea. And I only wore plastic. So the label that you see here is actually from my actual fleece that I got this Christmas. So I wore this thing relentlessly over the course of the experiment. Over the 6 days of this experiment, much to my family's annoyance, I sampled my poo every day. And I shipped these samples off to the lab, and they took a look. They did a variety of filtrations and different digestions, and then took a look at the samples under the microscope to see what they could find. Over the course of a few days of this experiment, I generated nearly 1 kilogram of plastic waste. You can see this is the actual pile of plastic that I went through: plastic packaging, plastic water bottles. Just an enormous amount of plastic, but not that dissimilar from what millions of Canadians will be doing every day. The products that I used, I got at my local grocery store. The plastic that I encountered every day would be very similar to the daily experience of many Canadians. And this was the result of my experiment. Not only did we find that I had microplastics in me on every day of this period, but after 3 days of eating and wearing more plastics, the number of microplastics in my body significantly increased. What you see here on the screen on the left is the actual sample under the microscope. On the right, it's the sample under black light, and plastic fluoresces under black light. So the little specks you can see are just some of the microplastics that were found in my poo later in the experiment after exposing myself to a greater amount of plastic every day. The other thing that we discovered is that you can actually identify the specific type of plastic in the human body. So we found 3 types of plastic in me: acrylic and polyester, fibers that had to have come from the clothing that was in my environment, and polystyrene particles that had to have come from food packaging. And so the sum total of the microplastics in me were a combination of what I was eating and drinking and what I was inhaling in terms of the household dust in my environment. So, the question becomes, does all of this matter? Okay, I found microplastics in me. Okay, the amount of microplastic increased based on how much plastic I was exposing myself to. But does it matter? And the answer is yes. These are just a few of the scientific studies, medical studies that have started coming out the last few months. There's an enormous amount of concern in the scientific community about the human health impacts of plastics. A lot of these microplastics are small enough to pass from our gut into our bloodstreams. The scientists that I spoke to over the last few months are wondering about what happens when microplastics start accumulating in organs like our liver, kidneys, lymphatic systems, organs that are trying to clean our blood. What happens if microplastics are winding up in our brains? And is there a link to Alzheimer's disease? One scientist I chatted with, a leader in this field, was wondering about the impact of microplastics in our brain, because plastic does not conduct electricity. So if we have microplastic literally in our heads, is that impeding neurotransmission? All of the scientists I talked to are increasingly concerned about the human health impacts of these microplastics. And though it's weird, I can say that I'm the first person in North America who knows for sure that there's microplastics in my body. I have no doubt that that means that microplastics are in all of you, they're in all of us, they're in all of our kids. And this is going to be a huge and emerging health question in addition to an environmental question over the next few years. I want to leave it here. You can read more about this study on the Broadbent Institute website, broadbentinstitute.ca. I want to thank Environmental Defense again for organizing this event. The last thing I want to say is that though this is a scary and a huge and a dangerous problem, it's entirely solvable. And I look forward to the question and answer later, and I look forward to working with all of you over the next months and years to take action on this issue and make sure that our health is protected from these microplastics. Thanks very much, Tim. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Rick. For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Rick Smith, who shared with us his latest body burden research on microplastics. Next, we have with us Dr. Chelsea Rockman. Chelsea is an assistant professor in ecology at the University of Toronto and a scientific advisor to the Ocean Conservancy. At the University of Toronto, Chelsea has been researching the sources, sinks, and ecological implications of plastic debris in marine and freshwater habitats for more than a decade. She has published dozens of scientific papers in respected journals and has led international working groups about plastic pollution. Today, Chelsea is going to chat about the latest in microplastics research and how humans are exposed to microplastics and how this exposure impacts our health. Over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks everybody for joining us. What I thought I would focus on today is basically how we grew to know microplastics as an ocean pollutant to an everywhere pollutant. I'm going to share a bit of the history and then talk a little bit about what we know about it as a contaminant. So I'm going to start with the timeline of 1970. So it was actually about 50 years ago, when microplastic or small plastic pollution was first discovered floating in the middle of the ocean, thinking about how it might contaminate and potentially affect our ocean life. And then in around the 1990s, which you might have heard about this, Captain Charles Moore discovered what he coined the garbage patch. So accumulations of plastic in the middle of the ocean, which really highlighted this issue as an ocean problem. But over the years, we've started to learn a lot more. And we know that plastic pollution, including microplastic, and I guess in particular microplastic, is everywhere, including in our oceans, but also in our freshwater ecosystems and in our terrestrial environments where we live. This includes some of the ecosystems that we know and love, including right here at home, if you're here in Toronto on the Great Lakes. And if you have this extensive contamination in an ecosystem, then often you have contamination in the organisms that we know and love. So more than 220 species of wildlife have been reported to eat microplastic, but that number grows every year, and you might note that that is a 2017 number, and so I would say that it's probably now in the 300s. But because of this, the resources that we pull from aquatic ecosystems also have microplastics in them. So we find them in seafood, we find them in sea salt, and unfortunately, we find them in our drinking water. So what are they? I just want to talk a little bit about this complex contaminant. Tim described that they're small pieces of plastic. I've made the argument before that they deserve to be their own suite of contaminant because they encompass many different, tens of different types of polymer types, each having a unique suite of chemical additives, so the different plasticizers and coloring dyes that make them bendy, flexible, durable, you name it, which go into making them a specific product. And over time, they break down into smaller and smaller sizes, even into the nano range. And we find them in the environment in different shapes, different colors, and with different contaminants accumulated to them. So I've made this argument, as I said, that they should be their own contaminant suite. Now, Rick mentioned them as a toxin. Are they the same as some of these other contaminants or pollutants we know out there, such as persistent organic pollutants? That term is used to define a group of contaminants which are regulated under the Stockholm Convention. And to be a persistent organic pollutant, you must be toxic, persistent, bioaccumulate, so go into the tissues of an organism, be prone to long-range atmospheric transport, and likely to cause significant adverse human health or environmental effects. So let's see, are microplastics potentially a persistent organic pollutant? Many have argued they are. Do they possess toxic characteristics? In our lab, as well as in research labs of others, we find that when we expose organisms to microplastics, they can be toxic. Not every study finds this, but several do. And I want to point to two examples. One, the Schur et al. Paper, which finds that when Daphnia, so zooplankton, are exposed to either no microplastics of increasing concentrations, or particles that are clay, so just the physical particle themselves, they see a decrease in reproduction over generations, showing a toxic effect from the microplastics, not a physical effect from a particle. We have found that with tire dust in our lab, we see mortalities and deformities in embryonic fish. We also see this weird thing where the pigmentation in the eyes goes away. And that, again, seems like a chemical toxic effect. So yes, they can be toxic. Are they persistent? No doubt about it. Tim alluded to this. I think Rick did as well. Plastics end up in the environment. Over time, they physically degrade with sunlight and mechanical wave activity into smaller and smaller pieces. But we think it takes tens to thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, depending on the size originally, to break down into its individual monomers, which then can be biodegraded. Do they bioaccumulate? Rick mentioned this. There's evidence that they can transfer outside the gut into the tissues or the bloodstreams of organisms. To bioaccumulate, then you also have to increase over time. Do they increase over time in the tissues? We don't know. But there's evidence here. You can see a little polystyrene sphere inside of a blood cell of a mussel, so like a clam, a bivalve. And then here you can see that over time that microplastic is retained in the body, suggesting bioaccumulation may indeed occur, and we need more science to fully understand it. Are they prone to long-range transboundary atmospheric transport? Yes. Tim, I think, alluded to this study in Science that came out about a month ago showing microplastics raining down in US national parks. There's also studies showing them coming down with snow in the Arctic. So they certainly resuspend into the air, transport in global dust cycles, and come down with precipitation or just dry events. And finally, are they likely to cause significant adverse human health or environmental effects? So it's that significant environmental effect or human health effect that leads us to still have this question mark. There's evidence of toxicity in wildlife. I talked to you about that. There's evidence now for some effect in humans. There's starting to be publications coming out suggesting how they interact with human cell lines, for example, or tissues. But often to get to that real question of severe environmental effect, sometimes we have to see the disaster in nature before we see it in our labs. So I want to point you to a very common and, I guess, well-known persistent organic pollutant, which is DDT. It's been banned for many years. It was famously used to combat malaria and mosquitoes. However, it also was thinning the eggshells of predatory birds and causing certain species to become threatened or endangered. And as you can see here, this happened with the brown pelican. And so in this case, an environmental disaster happened before we had enough evidence from the science. So my goal as a researcher is try to increase this weight of scientific evidence before we see ecological or human health damage. As an ecologist, we're doing work in the experimental lakes area in northwestern Ontario, and medical scientists, human biologists, cell systems biologists are working to discover this evidence in humans. But I will tell you that we have laid a big foundation of scientific evidence about their persistence, their ubiquity, the way they can interact with organisms and wildlife, that can certainly inform maybe international policy on this issue, but also local policy. So Ashley's going to talk a bit about what's happening here in Canada. And I just want to remind everybody that we all have this shared goal to get our plastic waste out of the environment. So I'm excited to hear from her about what we're doing here at home. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Dr. Chelsea Rockman from the University of Toronto on the latest in microplastics research and how microplastics could be impacting human health. Now we're going to turn it over to our final guest, Ashley Wallis. Ashley is the Environmental Defense's Plastics Program Manager. Ashley holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's in Environment and Sustainability, both from Western University. Since joining Environmental Defense, she has led our water campaign and now manages the campaign to end plastic pollution in Canada. No small feat. Ashley is going to walk us through what Canada needs to be doing right now to address plastic pollution. Over to you, Ashley.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Chelsea and Rick, and everyone who's joining us today. As Tim said, I'm going to bring us home and talk a little bit about the situation in Canada, what we need to see in terms of national policy to get Canada towards zero plastic waste. And a lot of the policy we're going to be talking about is focused on reducing macroplastic pollution, so large plastic items. But as Chelsea and Rick have kind of spoken about, we know that macroplastics become microplastics. So, in Canada, only about 9% of our plastic waste is recycled. Most of it is sent to landfills, but some is also sent to incinerators or ends up in the environment. The reality is that oil and gas production is heavily subsidized, so it's incredibly cheap to make new plastics from virgin fossil fuels. The costs of collecting and recycling plastic are quite high, so recycled content is often much more expensive than virgin material. And dumping plastic into the environment is basically free. So really, we do need Canada to put in place some strong waste policies that hold producers responsible, ban problematic plastics, and dramatically increase reuse and recycling. And that was the slide I meant to show you. So the next one. The first step here is for Canada to actually add plastics to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act's toxic substance list. Now, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is the law that the federal government has available at its fingertips to regulate plastics. And this is the same law that the government used to ban microbeads. Canada has done a science assessment, and they have confirmed, in fact, surprise, surprise, that plastics are toxic to the environment. This confirms that plastics should be on the toxic substance list. And so now we really just need the feds to follow through and propose a regulation to eliminate plastic waste. But what should that regulation include? Well, first off, we need to dramatically reduce the amount of plastic trash we're producing in the first place. This isn't a crisis that we can solve with recycling alone. And this is a great opportunity for bans, and specifically bans that address the massive problem of single-use plastics. Almost half of Canada's plastic waste is from single-use items such as straws, bottles, plastic cutlery, bags, and packaging. A lot of this material is impractical or sometimes even impossible to recycle, and it is commonly found littered in the environment. So if Canada is really serious about addressing plastic waste, it needs to ban a variety of these unnecessary single-use items. Next, right now there is a huge disconnect between the people who produce plastic goods and packaging and those that manage it. In most jurisdictions around the country, it's municipalities that are the ones that pay for and operate recycling systems. But companies are the ones that are inundating the market with complex materials like multi-layer pouches, things that baby food comes in, lightweight films. And Canada needs to make producers financially and operationally responsible for collecting and recycling their products at end of life. This is called extended producer responsibility. And what it does is incentivizes producers to design products and packaging that is easier to collect and recycle or manage at its end of life. It might even encourage some producers to redesign their product altogether and eliminate waste entirely. But making producers responsible only works if Canada sets and enforces high recycling targets. So these would be regulated targets that companies would be mandated to achieve. The targets would need to be material specific, so not just one huge target for all of plastics, but a specific target for each type of plastic material. And the targets would need to be high enough to actually push producers to consider new materials or investments in technologies that would allow them to better sort, reuse, or recycle plastic waste. And finally, Canada needs to support the recycling industry by establishing minimum recycled content requirements for new products. With a large supply of subsidized fossil fuels, which I mentioned earlier, it's often cheaper for companies to just use new material when they're making new goods. And because recycled materials are often more expensive, that further reinforces this continued use of new material. To help stimulate demand for recycled plastics, the government needs to require that plastic producers use a minimum percentage of recycled content in any new products or packaging. And there's actually a lot more that the government can be doing, both the federal government and provincial and territorial governments. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to our website, environmentaldefense.ca, go to our reports page. In 2018, we released a report, Talking Trash, which is a great overview of the problem and some of these high-level policy solutions. And just in March of this year, we released No Time to Waste, which delves a little bit deeper into 6 things we think that various governments can do in the short term to help get us on track to zero plastic waste. And Tim, I think it's back to you.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I wasn't sure if you were completely done. Thanks so much for that. So we've covered the gamut here of a firsthand experiment with microplastics. Chelsea helped us dive into the science behind why this is problematic, and Ashley's give us a bit of an overview of what governments can be doing. So what I want to try and do now is dig into these issues a little bit more detail with some questions. I have a couple that just came to mind while the speakers were chatting, but also there's a number coming in from the audience that I want to make sure that we cover. So first one for Rick. You have now very, very firsthand experience by watching the plastic build up in your body. Has that stimulated you to run screaming from polyester fleece jackets, or what are some of the things you've done to maybe try and reduce your level of exposure, and any advice for folks that are watching today?
Yeah, fundamentally, let me say I'm pretty optimistic about our ability to together solve this problem. Yes, on the one hand, as you've indicated and Chelsea's outlined and Ashley's talked about, yes, this is a ridiculous, crazy, enormous problem we've created for ourselves. But if we can cut back on the further production of unnecessary plastic, if in our own lives we can make some decisions to limit our own and our family's own use of plastic, I think what we're going to find is that the level of plastic in our bodies will decrease or won't continue to increase. So for sure, I try to wear, despite my getting the very lovely polyester fleece for Christmas, I try to wear cotton and wool whenever I can. That's not always possible. I like to camp, so wool clothing when you're camping is not that great. Certainly when I shop for food for our family, I try to, whenever possible, I try to go for products that are not packaged in plastic. I go for glass, I go for metal, I go for paper. I try to bring reusable bags. The good news is that a lot of this is getting easier. There are great products out there. My wife just brought back a new product the other day that's sort of a new kind of a reusable film that you can use instead of saran wrap all the time. So I think over the next little while, we're going to see new, better, greener products that are easy for consumers and that we can use to replace the plastics in our lives.
Yeah, our civilization survived a long time without being able to just throw away plastics every day. So we can probably, get along with at least significant reductions, if not elimination. One of our audience members asked a question that is directly in line with this conversation. Is Sama asking, if you use a high quality water filtration system on your tap water, is that going to stop plastic, or is it going to get through it anyway? Do you know?
I think it will help. I would actually, Chelsea Rockman is my source of all microplastics information in water. So I don't know, Chelsea, if there's been studies actually looking. Intuitively it makes sense. I don't know if there's been any peer-reviewed studies looking at that.
I don't know if there's been peer-reviewed studies, but I could tell you that every plastic lab out there has an RO filter on their lab to not contaminate our samples. And so when we test tap water versus RO, yes, it makes a huge difference. So without a peer-reviewed study, I feel quite comfortable telling people an RO tap will keep it out of your body and out of the environment, because that tap water goes down the drain.
Oh, that's really good to know, actually. And a related, well, not a related question, but an exposure-related question for Chelsea is that, something that comes to mind is, are plastics acting like other toxins in the environment where there's kind of an increasing risk with increasing exposure, or perhaps they a bit more like things like, our concerns around hormone disruptors where, even very tiny amounts are putting people at risk, or do we know?
It's a great question. We do know that there is evidence of dose-dependent responses. And I did, when I showed the picture of the Daphnia, that graph, it actually does kind of, you see the survival go down with increasing concentrations. But we've also seen in our lab fish respond in the way you're saying, where with the lower concentration, we saw a difference in how many eggs they were laying, and at the higher concentration, it seemed to change. So, and this is because it's that complex mixture of contaminants where those endocrine disrupting chemicals are in the mix, but then there's also other stuff. So it's incredibly complex to fully understand the whole picture.
Right, makes sense. A couple of more questions coming in from our audience. Here's one from Norman. PPE for COVID-19 depends heavily upon plastics, including vinyl gloves, plexiglass screens, etc. How can we safely change this? And I would add, is there as much of a need for all this plastic as maybe the plastics industry likes to tell us? Maybe Ashley, I know you've done a little bit of digging on this, and maybe you can answer this.
Yeah, so I think, okay, first of all, I'll say that a few weeks ago, I guess about a month ago now, a bunch of health practitioners came out and said that we actually don't need as much single-use disposable plastic as we've been made to believe during the pandemic. So, there's been a huge move towards a lot of other single-use plastics being used, like single-use disposable plastic bags, produce that never came wrapped in plastic, now being wrapped in plastic, all kind of in the name of hygiene. And the truth is that disposable packaging presents some of the same issues as reusable packaging, in that, like, it's still being touched by people. People could still be coughing on it in the grocery store. It's not necessarily keeping us safe. What's most important is to practice good hygiene and make sure that we're washing our hands and we're washing things that we're putting to our mouths, etc. So I think that's an important piece to acknowledge. I do recognize that the increase in PPE, specifically things like gloves, masks, plexiglass, this is an increase in plastic use that I think we can kind of get behind a little bit more, but we do need to have better systems in place for actually collecting and managing this stuff. A lot of folks have reached out to me recently because they have seen huge amounts of gloves and masks on streets, in parks. And there was recent news from Europe about like huge amounts of masks washing up on shorelines in Britain. So an opportunity here is that as the federal government is considering regulations to address plastic, they could look at their own green procurement strategy. So the federal government is actually a buyer of a huge amount of PPE. If they required that the companies providing this PPE put in place appropriate collection and recycling systems, we could see advancements in technology that would allow us to capture this material and actually turn it into something else valuable, as opposed to it ending up in our environment.
Great, thanks so much. One of the conversations that goes around with reducing plastics, of course, is substitution. What could we use that replaces those plastics? So one of our audience members here, Randy, asks, aren't there successes with new compostable materials, for example, cornstarch bags, versus using the dreaded plastic, she says. So, is there a solution in this plastics problem with substitution of things that are based on natural chemicals? And maybe again to Ashley, actually, because I know that this is something that you've dug into as well.
Yeah, so I think that there is some opportunity for sure with switching to alternative materials. I mean, we talk about that when we talk about using paper bags, for example, instead of plastic bags. One of the things we need to be mindful of, though, is that a lot of so-called bioplastics, so plastics that are being made from things like cornstarch, are being like the positive part is they're not using fossil fuels to manufacture that. So there could be potentially a lower carbon footprint, but the manufacturing process actually produces a plastic that is basically identical to a petrochem plastic. Or it looks the same as a petrochem plastic, but it doesn't respond the same way in recycling facilities. So some of these new bioplastics are actually really problematic. They're bad for recycling systems because if they end up in recycling systems, they can't be broken down like other plastics. And a lot of municipal compost facilities still won't accept them because they won't break down properly there. And they're not actually biodegradable in our own backyard composters either. So I think that, you know, when we're analyzing or evaluating these new kind of alternative materials, we're going to want to make sure that we're prioritizing compostability that happens under natural conditions or that happens in the oceans, which is an entirely other situation where you need to ensure that something is breaking down fully into organic materials.
Great, thanks. A question for Rick. Karen is wondering, did you find out ways that you can push the microplastics out of your body once they're in there, or are they stuck there forever? Is there any way of like accelerating the process of removing them from your body? And I don't know if you've figured out any techniques there, Rick, given your experience, or maybe Chelsea might have something to say about what research says about the body's ability to rid itself of these plastics.
Yeah. I mean, the real answer is that this science is really new and we don't know. I talked to a lot of scientists for the Globe and Mail column, and there's some evidence to believe that that depending on the type of particle, depending on the type of plastic, some of these particles, once they're inside of us, may wind up in different parts of our bodies. So, for instance, those smaller particles that are able to pass into the bloodstream. Some evidence to believe that they may wind up in the lymphatic system or in organs that are trying to clean our blood. There's some older studies, for instance, that look at an earlier generation of hip replacement operations that were made out of a more degradable type of plastic, and it turns out that a lot of those little particles that were shedding from early hip replacement operations did wind up dispersing into the body and accumulating in places like lymph nodes. So the answer is we don't know, but there certainly it seems like some particles, once they're in us, may stay in us for a while, and then the question becomes, okay, well, what damaging effect might that have? Because of the physical effect of having particles in us, the aggravating effect of having particles in it, and then the chemical impact of the constituent chemicals in those plastic particles starting to ooze out into our bodies. I mean, we know that there are hormone disrupting chemicals like phthalates, like BPA, in a lot of these plastic particles. What happens if these little point sources of pollution, these plastic particles, remain embedded in us for years on end and are constantly oozing these chemical components into our bodies every day of our lives? So I think what we're going to see over the next little while is a huge increase in scientific research in this area, and I think the evidence is only going to get more worrisome.
Yeah, so for you, Chelsea, I mean, is that kind of the twin prongs of research focus here is, you know, the physical consequences of actually having these chunks of plastic and floating around your body, but also perhaps the degradation pathways of the plastic once it's there, because it is going to degrade. It's each type probably in its own pathway. But are those kind of parallel areas for research focus for the science community?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, well, one of the reasons why I think it does deserve its own group as a contaminant suite is because it's a physical particle which behaves differently than a chemical that's dissolved. But also it's a bit of a multiple stressor, right? You've got this physical effect, so the hip study that Rick is talking about, they found inflammation in the body, and that is an inflammation can be something that eventually can lead to a tumor, whether it's cancerous or not. But then there's this other part, which could be a chemical effect. And as plastics break down, they release those chemicals. A good example of this is people probably remember as Nalgene sort of transformed to BPA free, right? Well, it wasn't the BPA additive was added into the plastic. It was made out of bisphenol A. It was the monomer that made up the polymer. And so as the plastics broke down, that was what was getting into the body. So it's, yes, as they degrade, some of those chemicals become more bioavailable. So I do think, again, adding to that complexity, it's a bit of a multiple stressor.
Great, thanks. I have a couple of comments here that are interesting, just about the relationship, or maybe lack thereof, between individual behavior, things that people can do to reduce their exposure themselves, or changes in their purchase behavior relative to the policy and legislative changes that we need to really tackle this problem. And I think from the comments here, a few people are kind of frustrated by this, feeling that like individual boycotts, not buying things is sort of what they feel like they can do, but it feels so far from actually fixing the system. And actually, maybe if you can comment on this, because I mean, there's boycotts, but there's also boycotts, and perhaps some of those may be helping setting the stage to actually get this bigger change in the policy and legislative environment. Maybe you could just explore that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think, what we've seen over the last probably 3 to 5 years is a huge increase in concern about the growing plastic pollution crisis. I think that we're seeing governments move to action because there has been a dramatic increase in individual action. And some businesses and companies are recognizing that their customers are expecting them to eliminate plastic packaging, or to consider alternative materials or alternative delivery systems. And as companies kind of start to try to get ahead of this, then government is stepping in and saying, okay, well, how can the regulatory framework support this? So this is to say that I do think that individual action is important, and what we do as individuals matters. However, we do need to have this overall systems level change. And I think that our current economy is set up in such a way where it's very linear. We take materials, we manufacture goods, we use them briefly, and then we throw them away. And we really need to see regulations in place that are getting Canada more towards a circular economy, where we're using the same materials over and over and over again. And that is something that you cannot do as an individual. As somebody who tries to walk the talk, I often am trying to, just like Rick, avoid plastics in my day-to-day life, but they are everywhere. And we need to make plastic-free more of the default than plastic everywhere being the rule.
Thanks so much. A question for Rick, and maybe Ashley would want to join in on this as well. There seems to me to be a bit of a disconnect between commitments that governments are making at a federal level and sometimes provincially to try and reduce plastics or circularize the economy, but also the conversation that's occurring with the plastics and the oil industry about doubling plastic production at the same time. How are these things compatible? How can we be talking about doubling plastic production, massive subsidization of new plastic production facilities, which we're seeing happening in Canada? It feels like those conversations really don't make a lot of sense to a lot of folks. And just your thoughts about that?
No, I mean, Tim, I think you're entirely right. I mean, those things are completely incompatible. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Our whole, again, let me just repeat, because it's kind of mind-boggling. Half of all the plastics ever made have been made in the last 13 years. Mm. So the acceleration here is just incredible. And of course, we know this as consumers. I mean, every time you go into the grocery store, there's some other crazy overpackaging, something or other. Every holiday when you give gifts, especially if you have kids, I mean, the overpackaging is insane. It's getting worse, not better. Mm. I went to Canada's biggest plastic packaging convention here in Toronto in the before times last year. There's thousands of people going through this thing. And it was like, I wrote about this in the Globe. I mean, it was as though this whole plastic pollution debate wasn't occurring. Like there were thousands of people doing deals in this hall, huge plastic packaging machines, and like it was, the good times are rolling. And it's as though the debate we're having today wasn't even happening. So the plastic industry, its relationship with the government, our whole system of plastic regulation has been an abject failure over the last decade and a bit. We need to completely overhaul it, and the pressure to do that has got to come from individual Canadians, individual consumers. As Ashley just said, both exercising our power as consumers and trying to use alternatives, trying to support companies that are doing better. One huge thing that I think needs to happen: anybody that buys organic food should be demanding that organic food stop with the plastic and the overpackaging. I mean, quite often in the grocery store, it's organic food that I'm buying that has that's the worst offender in terms of plastic packaging, and that's got to stop. So we need to exercise our power as consumers and as voters, and demand that the federal government in Canada this year not only list plastic as toxic, but come out immediately with a resulting ban list to, by the end of 2020, start getting us away from useless plastic straws, cutlery, packaging, you name it. It's got to start this year.
Yeah, I think that's really key too, and provides that linkage between the individual action and the change that needs to occur at the societal level as well. I mean, I know that for myself and friends, family, etc., that quite often when you're first discover an issue and like digging into it, making changes in your own life, I mean, you very quickly realize, hey, this is going to solve the problem. And like plastic, it's like, okay, I'm really careful about the plastic I buy, and my street is still full of it. So, but it helps you support businesses that perhaps are doing things differently because you're a new customer
Absolutely.
for them, and that makes a big difference. But it also raises the priority in your own mind when you're talking to your political leaders and stuff about them doing something about that in a way that if you don't dig into it and don't change your own personal behavior, perhaps you wouldn't. So there is a linkage. Sometimes they say far removed. And I know for environmental defense supporters, sometimes it can be frustrating because they think like, I'm trying, but I'm not changing the world with my individual behavior. And of course, that's a very astute observation that you're not, but you're never going to get there unless a lot of people, like your friends, your family, understand it the way that you do. So I think that's really key.
Well, just very quickly, I mean, there's a relationship, of course. It's when you exercise your power as a consumer, and you support some companies and not others, and enough people start doing that, what happens is that in a crowded, competitive marketplace, some companies start to move away from toxic chemicals, crappy packaging. They start to prosper in the market. They start to differentiate their brand based on a greener packaging, a greener formulation. That then exposes the companies that are not moving. And all of that makes it easier for governments to act. And that's what we saw. I mean, Chelsea mentioned, that's what we saw in the case of BPA, where all of a sudden in the marketplace, almost overnight, because of the great work of environmental defense and others, some companies, some baby bottle companies started moving away from BPA. Others didn't, but the government was able to say all of a sudden, you know what? We're now going to level the playing field with this new, greener, safer standard. And you laggard companies are out of luck. We're moving forward here. So there's a very important relationship between that corporate pressure and then the ability of governments to move. Absolutely.
We are running out of time soon, so I really want to give a chance to each of our speakers today just to come up with their one thing that they really want to that they want the viewers to take away from today's chat. So why don't we start with Ashley, and then we'll go to Rick and Chelsea.
One thing. Okay, so I think that, as we just said, it's such a huge, far-reaching issue. But I think what I would want to say is, individual action is great, but we do really need to have this systems level change. And I think that we are kind of at a really we're at like a pivotal moment in that we have the federal government talking about this issue. They have committed to banning single-use plastics as early as 2021. I think that if MPs and members of cabinet hear from the public that this is still an issue that we are passionate about and we want to see action on, there's really a huge opportunity here for us to achieve the kind of systems level change we need. And I think that is incredibly important also from an equity perspective, because I think in a lot of ways right now, the zero waste movement has really focused on people who are richer and more privileged. And we need to make sure that going zero waste and eliminating plastic pollution is something that everybody can do and that it benefits all communities in the planet.
Thanks so much. Rick?
Well, I hope, first of all, thank you again to Environmental Defense for organizing this. And thank you to everybody listening in the middle of the summer. I guess the one thing I hope people take away from this is to think differently and talk differently about the plastic problem. Plastic is not just an environmental problem. It's not just a problem kind of out there in the ocean affecting wildlife, as important as that is. But we need to start conceiving of plastic and talking about it as a human health crisis. Plastic is not just out there, it's in us, it's in our kids, it's circulating in the ecosystem, and so every bit of plastic that we throw away comes back at us in microplastic in tap water and in the air. And I think if we can convey the notion of plastic as a human health crisis, we're going to start winning this issue this year and moving forward. Thanks
a lot. Chelsea, last word for you.
Sure.
Well, before I wrap up.
No problem. Thank you. I'll sort of go back to a bit about what Ashley was talking about. I think, one, I guess we were talking earlier about this increased plastic production. So when we've run models to see what do we predict with increasing plastic production, and if we keep business as usual around the amount of plastic going into the ocean. If we keep business as usual, in the next 10 years, the amount of plastic going into the environment, so aquatic ecosystem and ocean, is going to quadruple. So we don't have time to waste, no pun intended. And we certainly do need a systems level change, which is what Ashley said. And I think one of the things that's really important is we need to change the way that we make, the way that we purchase, so that's consumer power, and use plastic, and also clean up. We already got this stuff in the environment, so there's no one size fits all solution. We all need to work together, and we need to change the plastics economy. We need to also invest in cleanup, and we need to use our wallet and fight with our wallet in a way that's affordable to everyone, right? To reduce the amount of material that we truly use. And I am optimistic it can happen, but we are at a pivotal moment, and I hope we maintain this momentum despite what's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, and that sense of urgency, I think, really needs to be maintained. And clearly the science, people's experience in their day-to-day lives, and of course, firsthand experience with accumulating microplastics, as Rick has experienced, really underlines that for all of us. Thank you so much to the three of you. I think it was a really interesting conversation, ranging from the personal to the scientific to the policy. But it is the end of our time. So probably most of you online are wondering, okay, well, what can I do to help? Well, there is something you can do. As Ashley has mentioned, last June, Prime Minister Trudeau committed to banning some single-use plastics as early as next year. This is a huge win. I mean, this hasn't been done before. And it is a significant and a signaling step towards zero plastic waste. But we've only had 5 months before it's 2020, so the time's running out. We can't really afford any further delays. The government needs to follow through on this promise. They need to do it this year. So if you could take a moment and visit environmentaldefense.ca/end Canadian plastic pollution. You can take an action there to connect with your elected representatives to tell government to follow through on this promise. I really want to thank you as well for doing that, and for all the other things that you as environmental defense supporters do, from tuning in today to learning more about these issues to taking actions. Thanks again to our speakers, Dr. Rick Smith, Dr. Chelsea Rockman, and Ashley Wallis for your incredible expertise and insights today. And please keep in touch with us at Environmental Defense. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or you can reach out to any of us by email. Thanks very much, and have a great weekend coming up. Take care.